Bismillah wa salatu wassalam ala rasulillah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. So today we're talking about a somewhat contentious issue of reparations for African Americans for them having been descendants of slaves who were deprived of adequate compensation for their labor, and not just deprived of adequate compensation for their labor, but also oppressed and abused in ways that were had no precedent, that were unprecedented in history, right? If you study the way slaves were treated in Africa, the way slaves were treated in the United States, the African American slaves, how they were treated in the United States compared to how slaves were treated everywhere else, you will find that the treatment of slaves by the Christian Europeans of the United States, the treatment of their slaves was much worse, significantly much worse than the treatment of slaves anywhere else, because it was systemic and it was institutionalized and it was supported by the authorities. While slavery existed everywhere on the planet, the type of abuse that was suffered by African Americans is completely unprecedented. And even after slavery was abolished by the Europeans in the United States, there was another almost 100 years of heinous racism, again, institutionalized racism, in the form of Jim Crow, lynchings, segregation, things like the Tuskegee experiment, the housing projects, housing social projects, the KKK, overwhelmingly, most of which was supported by the United States government and endorsed by the United States government. So that's the backstory, right? This is what happened. This is what is exceptional in terms of the abuses that was experienced by the slaves in the United States. So the argument is that the descendants of those slaves have a right to some sort of compensation. And typically this is envisioned as some sort of a financial compensation, but I disagree. I'll get to that later. But I want to also mention that this whole compensation, or this whole issue of compensating the slaves or the descendants of slaves for the slavery is not unprecedented, because we have examples during similar time period, lasting until the modern day today, where the descendants of slave owners in the UK were receiving reparations for having to give up slavery. They were receiving reparations from the UK government for having to give up slavery. So you have descendants who are alive today, 3-4 generations back. Their ancestors were slave owners who owned plantations, who owned slaves, and because the UK, the British government, the British Empire forced or legislated that they give up slavery, they were entitled to compensation for having to lose that economic resource or economic asset. So the government of the British Empire decided that it was worthy and just for them to pay these individuals almost into perpetuity their descendants even. I mean, such was the vast amount of money that they were getting. All right? So the government of the British Empire decided to pay these people, these owners of slaves, compensation for having to give up slavery. And their descendants, up until I believe the 2017 was the last payment made for the descendants of the slave owners. The descendants of slave owners were getting reparations for having to give up slavery. Similarly, France, the French government, one of the conditions for them giving Haiti its freedom was that Haiti had to compensate or give reparations to France for having to give up slavery. No one questions that. No one from the West, anyway, has an issue with that in terms of the British government or the French government saying, well, you know what, this is not right. But when African American reparations is brought up, suddenly there's, hold on, well, we have to think about this. Why? Is it really justified? That was so many years ago, so many generations now. No one owns slaves today. But for some reason, the same argument is not applied in an even-handed and just manner when it comes to the descendants of slaves. The descendants of the slave owners, no problem, we'll give them their compensation. The descendants of slaves, we have to think about it. We don't know where there's a hesitancy there. So that's the backstory. And having said all of that, I do believe that African Americans in particular should receive reparations, but not the type of reparations that most people think is going to be beneficial. Because what's the point of reparations, right? We have to analyze what was lost throughout the time of slavery was an adequate financial allotment of wealth, right? So slaves were deprived of a legitimate form, not only legitimate, but an adequate market, reasonable amount of compensation for their labor. They were basically oppressed and underpaid for their labor. So, and also their freedom, they didn't have the freedom to leave and find work elsewhere or go back to Africa for the most part, or anything of that, for that matter. So those the two things are what need to be compensated for. There's a value that can be placed on that, right? We can quantify, in terms of dollars, what would be an adequate compensation to the descendants of the slaves today. But my argument, that is somewhat controversial, is that not only should reparations be paid, but it should not be done in the form of monetary issuances. It should not be cash. It should not be credit. It should not be financial. Why do I say that? Because I believe that I believe that due to the successful and deliberate attempts by the American upper or government class to cause African American culture to be dysfunctional, right? If the average African American received a $10,000 check, for example, from the government, that is not going to improve their lives in any significant way, because of the dysfunction in the African American culture. That 10,000 is most likely going to be wasted. It could be 10,000, 50,000, 100,000, it could be a million. That amount of money is going to be wasted on nonsense. Buying a car, which is a depreciable asset, not even an asset really, for the most part, right? Buying clothing, handbags, getting cosmetic surgery. The money from reparations or any financial payback, compensation, should be directed towards social and educational programs that would affect positive change in the dysfunctional nature or in the dysfunctional aspects of African American culture. Because not all of African American culture is dysfunctional, but a significant part of it is, to the effect that you find 30% of prison inmates are African American. That is a significant problem within the culture. So my solution is to come up with social programs that would cause the inmate population of the prison system of the United States to cause it to be significantly reduced. So instead of it being 30% of the inmate population being African Americans, we can reduce it to something that's more manageable and reasonable, maybe 5%. Or just say, okay, it should be in proportion to the population of African Americans in the United States. So there are 13% the African Americans out of the entire American population, 30% of them are African Americans. So it should be a proportional representation in the prison system. It should not go beyond 13% African Americans in the prison system within the United States. That's when you know you've had a positive effect on African American culture. Under ideal circumstances, it should be even less. Under ideal circumstances, we really shouldn't have anyone being in prison, whether they be African American, Latino, or white, But the point is to use the money from reparations, to use it to positively impact and improve the living conditions and livelihoods for African Americans today and subsequent generations. We don't want this to be hey, take $100,000 and then a year from now, that money is gone and nothing has changed. Nothing has changed in terms of the African American culture. No, we want to improve that. That's the whole point of getting financial compensation and getting reparations. There's a gap that needs to be filled. It starts with finances, but the finances has to be directed towards programs that improve the life, the living conditions, the quality of life of, and the culture of African Americans. So this is my proposal, and this is my advice to anyone hearing this who might be interested or in a position to take this idea and run with it and to build upon it. Financial compensation is just going to be wasted. Financial compensation by itself, just money, handouts for money, say, okay, here you go, 100,000 for each African American. But a year from now, nothing will have changed because everyone would have bought, I wouldn't say everyone, overwhelmingly, most of the people would have bought things that are just a waste of money, and there would be no impact in terms of the quality of life and the social issues that are plaguing the African American culture today. Nothing would have changed. In fact, if I were a racist in the government, if I were a racist European American in the United States government who was responsible for this, issuing this money. I would say, yes, give them the money. Ultimately, it would come back into the system because they would go and spend it buying Louis Vuitton, Dolce & Gabbana, Gucci, vacations, flexing with with the latest clothes, buying expensive cars. All that money was going to come back into the system anyway. And who owns the system for the most part? Who runs the system? It's going to be white Americans, overwhelmingly. And they're going to benefit more than African Americans will because of irresponsible spending habits. The financial compensation is not going to help the culture, African American culture, in any way. So what needs to happen is the culture needs to be improved from the ground up. And again, it's not all of African American culture. There's the parts that are pervasively dangerous and cannibalistic. Those parts need to be rehabilitated. And this is how the reparations should be focused, in the rehabilitation of African American culture, with the end goal being that after 10, 20 years, or ideally less than a generation, we should be able to see a significant positive change in African American culture within the United States. And a major way to measure that, I'll say a good metric for this, is the prison systems. When we can reduce the inmate population of African Americans from being 30% to being 13% or less, then you've done something good and you've made progress. Anything else is just a waste of time and waste of money. So that's my advice for today. If you have any questions, requesting advice, send it to the email below in the description. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and share.